Senators have introduced a K-12 Cybersecurity Act, and Stephanie Condon with ZDNet is here to tell us a little bit more about this. So, Stephanie, just start off the top with the legislation and what's involved here.
Yeah, well, so we've heard a lot this year about how schools are increasingly coming under attack from ransomware and other forms of cyber attacks. And it looks like Congress is finally deciding that this needs to be addressed at the national level. So the K-12 Cybersecurity Act has two bipartisan sponsors, and it's always a good start for legislation when it has support from both sides of the aisle. So its sponsors are Democratic Senator Gary Peters from Michigan and Republican Senator Rick Scott from Florida. Like I said, good start, bipartisan support, but if it were passed, this bill only really begins to scratch the surface of the problems facing schools. It starts by basically telling the Department of Homeland Security that the threat of cyber attacks needs to be, first of all, just assessed on a national level. There are a number of cybersecurity firms that have come up with their own statistics, which we've heard a lot about here at ZDNet, about how many schools have been impacted by cyber attacks. But Congress wants to start by just getting some definitive numbers on the books. And from there, the agency would be required to put out recommendations and best practices for schools, as well as an online toolkit that would help schools to actually implement those best practices. And, this is really important when you look at some of the major events that happened this year. For instance, in Louisiana, the governor even had to implement a state of emergency after 3 school districts came under cyber attack, and their IT networks were taken down for a little while. And that was really handled pretty well, but it required a lot of resources, and certainly not every school district will be prepared for that sort of attack. So if this bill passes and the DHS put out best practices, that would be a great help. I'm sure some valuable resources for schools. It would be all voluntary for schools to take advantage of. And another thing to note is that it doesn't offer any funding for schools, and that's always a big issue when we're talking about school reform, right? And for schools that want to step up their cybersecurity protections, they would have these new guidelines, but not necessarily the resources.
Yeah, resources, as we know, Stephanie, are always stretched so thin in every state here in the United States. So you touched on it, but are schools looking for that funding from the government? Is that what they're asking for?
Yeah, so this is already a discussion that's ongoing. One thing I learned while reporting on this bill is that school advocates have been looking for specific cybersecurity funding from the Federal Communications Commission. The FCC runs what's called the E-rate program that provides funding for schools and libraries to help them pay for broadband. So some advocacy groups have wanted the FCC to update the program to include funding specifically for cybersecurity. That didn't happen this year. So that's something that advocates are still looking for. In the meantime, like every industry, schools are ramping up their IT budgets. So it's becoming a more pressing issue. I saw some research available that said tech spending at K-12 schools has increased 62% since 2016. So that's definitely something they're looking for from the government.
Yeah, and in terms of the school districts, because nothing moves really fast when you're talking about the government, and a lot of red tape and paperwork and things involved. So, Stephanie, is there anything that schools are doing while they're waiting, hoping for federal resources?
It does look like, of course, schools are run at such a local level. I haven't been able to find yet any big trends, but it does look like schools are appealing at least to state lawmakers for assistance here. And there are a handful of efforts in various states to tackle this issue. In Georgia this year, for instance, the state legislature approved new funding for cybersecurity training and cybersecurity initiatives in schools. And Texas passed a bill requiring school districts to develop and maintain cybersecurity frameworks. And there's also legislation being considered in Iowa to that relates to student data collection. So, implementing more stringent standards would certainly help. And Massachusetts and North Carolina are also considering new funding for cybersecurity education efforts, which is really important because, typically the weakest link is just people who don't know, what proper safeguards to put in place.
Yeah, that's what we see far too often, Stephanie. Well, we'll certainly continue to follow this. We appreciate your report. And for more on the legislation, make sure you check out ZDNet. Thanks for watching.